I'm Illya Szilak, and I am a virtual reality interactive storyteller and writer, director, installation artist, multidisciplinary artist, and also a physician by training. And I still work at Rikers Island Correctional Facility in New York City, taking care of inmates. Can everyone hear me? I just want to make sure that, can someone put it in the chat if you can hear me? Thank you, thanks. Okay, so VR, as everyone knows, has been famously called an empathy machine. And today I'd like to revisit that somewhat hyperbolic assessment by really focusing on the concept of VR as machine. So what do I mean by VR as machine? Let's see if I can get this to work. Hold on a second. Oh, here, I guess I have to do this. Sorry, give me a second. All right. There we go. Okay, so in his book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, Marshall McLuhan famously suggested that the medium is the message. And what he meant is that how information is received depends in a large part on the medium through which that information is transmitted. That is to say, if we can somewhat artificially divide up content and the way that that content is manifested for a receiver and how it interacts with and works upon the receiver, the latter is really what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on the sort of procedural logic of experience design, the spatial, emotional, and aesthetic choices which make a VR experience promote empathy. So I'm going to start by giving a quick and provocative overview of some of the concepts that I'm thinking about. And then I'm going to illustrate those concepts with our own experience making Queerskins Arc, which is actually part of the Games for Change virtual arcade. So the first thing that you need to know is that empathy is not just one thing. And I really love this diagram because it shows that empathy, as we think about it, really exists on a continuum in different forms along the intersection of these two vectors. So vertical view, you'll see that empathy can range from more physical motor responses to emotional mental responses. And on the horizontal view, we see that on one end, there's a conscious separation of self and other, real distinction between them. And on the other side, a more expansive sense of self, where that distinction between self and other is not so clear or not so overtly delineated. So I don't have time to go through all these different versions of empathy, but to suffice it to say that empathy can generally be divided into three kinds of categories. One is experience sharing, which is the feeling of emotions of another. Another is mentalizing, which is cognitive processing, which considers another person's point of view. And the last is pro-social concern, which is really having the motivation to improve the state or experience of another person. And all three of these can be modified by individual differences as well as social context. So the first question to ask is, number one, is VR actually more effective than other media in promoting any kind of empathy? And if it is, the second question is why? So there is actually data, pretty good data, to suggest that VR is more effective in promoting pro-social behavior in terms of perspective-taking tasks than other forms of media. However, the very specific aesthetic, narrative, emotional, interactive characteristics which would optimize this process have not been delineated. And on this screen, you see two of probably the most famous experiments looking at using VR perspective taking to promote empathy. Thousand Cut Journey, and Becoming Homeless, a Human Experience. So like these suggest, most experiments using VR to promote empathy have taken perspective taking and realism as their de facto approaches. And it's logical because it's really about sort of taking that old adage of walking a mile in someone else's shoes and making it real. But the question is really, is that the most effective approach? We don't know. To my knowledge, and please, someone out there correct me if I'm wrong, to my knowledge, there have been no comparisons of aestheticized experiences versus realistic experiences in their ability to promote any form of empathy. And nor has there been an exploration of how movement, other forms of agency or aesthetics might be used as tools to promote empathy. So rather than pretend that I know the answer, because I don't, I'm going to offer you a quick and wild ride. It's going to be really quick. It's really just to get you thinking and hopefully get you all excited about exploring novel approaches to empathy in VR. So here we go. We're going to start by going back 120 years. This is when French philosopher Henri Bergson writes a truly incredible little book called Matter and Memory. If you are in VR or XR, you must read this book. It really is profound and will change how you think about what you do, as well as possibly how you perceive the entirety of your reality. So anyways, Bergson in this book suggests that the universe is made up of an infinite number of possible perceptions, or what he calls images. And we, as human beings, select those images, the images that we decide to pay attention to, and the ones that we use to construct our world, and the ones that we maintain in our worldview is based on two relationships. One is the physical body, including mental states. And the second thing is memory, which can exist on a personal level, exist on a cultural level, and perhaps to some extent, even on a species level, and we'll get to that later. So we're going to jump up a little bit. This is 1909. Jakob von Uexküll writes an amazing book, another book. If you have not read this book, oh my God, you're in for a treat because it is a mind-blowing little book. In this book, von Uexküll basically looks at how the world might look to things and creatures which are not human beings. And in this is actually an illustration from the book. In the upper right-hand corner, you see his illustration of what this village scene looks like to a fly, and then below what the same village scene might look to a mollusk. And it is a mind-blowing book. So basically what Uexküll is suggesting is that there is no fixed reality, but a multiplicity of different kinds of realities. So that's really interesting. Let me get to where I need to go. Yeah, we're gonna go forward. Okay, so this is 100 years ago, but turns out that Bergson's and Uexküll's ideas are really, really interesting in relation to virtual reality because they resonate with some current theories of presence. Now, if you ask most people, what is it that makes VR such an amazing medium to create stories? And they're gonna say probably presence. And what presence is basically just the ability to feel that you are in this place, in this time, in a way that seems unmediated except by your senses. And there's many theories of presence. I'm not going to go into those, but one of the most intriguing, I think, was put forth by Riva and colleagues, which is based upon this guy, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's theories of the functioning of consciousness, the development of self and other, and embodied cognition. So this particular theory of presence suggests that it's a primordial function of consciousness, probably one of the earliest forms of human consciousness, one that helped us distinguish between self and other, and between our body and our environment. Now, notably, movement through and action in the world is critical for this consciousness to be operating. So basically, by interacting with the world, we create a potential map of ways of impacting the world. And this allows us to plan for future action that's guided by past knowledge. Essentially, we're making a virtual reality representation of the world in our head through this early consciousness. And although it's dependent upon motor and sensory input, the higher level organization also depends on selective attention, on meaning making, emotion, memory, cultural and personal expectations and desires. Now, there is evidence that the ability of VR to generate presence may actually be what makes it especially effective for generating emotion, empathy. And also that the potential for VR to promote empathy has also been attributed to the changes in emotional and cognitive processing that occur because participants can literally move around and engage with a virtual environment, which is different from pretty much any other media. So let's move on here. So the concepts of body and movement through a space being important to how we as human beings know the world has its corollary, not surprisingly, in language. So in the late 80s, linguists Lakoff and Johnson wrote what is now a super famous book called Metaphors We Live By, in which they did something really special. They analyzed the English language. And what they found is that body orientation basically is the source of our earliest and most resilient metaphors in our language. So a simple illustration of this is that in English, we think of as high as being a better, more socially and culturally elevated, and than low is. And we think of future as being in front of us somehow, whereas the past is thought to be situated behind us. And to us, this seems natural. Why would it be any other way? But when you really think about it, it seems to be this way, and it seems so natural because it's really the basis of the way we approach the world, which is through embodied knowledge. It's a great book. You do not have to be a linguist to read it, and I highly, highly recommend it. All right, let's move forward. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try it again. Okay, so this idea of embodied cognition is something that human-computer interaction designers have also recognized. So the so-called third wave HCI builds upon what the first two waves were. And in the first wave, really, human-computer interaction was a kind of engineering problem. How are we going to attach a human body to a computer body? How are we going to attach a human mind to a computer mind? How does that actually work in terms of doing it efficiently? And in the second wave of HCI, really looked at it a little bit more abstractly, how about information transfer? How can we make humans readable? How can we make computers readable, and vice versa? And emojis would be a good example of this. It's a way for computers to be able to read and quantify emotion. And now we move into third wave HCI, where computers are being looked at as McLuhan's extension of man, a way to support situated action in the world that recognizes values other than efficiency and accuracy, which are sort of computer-based values. Okay. And then even more recently, we've seen a number of books come out about SOMA aesthetic design, which is really about how neuroaesthetics and how embodied knowledge should play into design. And this is one of the books that really influenced me when I was trying to write the script for Queerskins Arc. And it's MIT Press, and I would highly, highly recommend it. So, you might say, well, this is all nice and good, but isn't this just like a bunch of philosophical hand waving? Like, what? I mean, you're going back to like, the early 1900s to talk about this stuff. So the answer is no, it's not. It's actually how human beings know the world. And this is these were just experiments that I found in some of the research that I had been doing, and I'm going to let you read the titles. But basically, what these experiments, and there are many different kinds of these experiments out there, show that human beings, the way we move our bodies, is how we perceive things. So ACI really has to start to account for those. For instance, the experiments you see here show that how powerful gesture and movement and aesthetics might be in changing our perception of others. Now, I don't have time to go through the details of these, but let me just say that in one of the experiments, the one on the top there, there was a measurable effect on how people perceived people of other races, depending on whether they were pulling a lever towards them or away from them. An incredibly simple gesture was able to change how people perceived race. So just think about that for a second. Think about how that might influence how you create and design a virtual reality experience. So I think it's pretty clear that exploring how the body movement in space might be productive in terms of VR is really something that empathy research should be looking at. So what about memory? All right. That's not it. Let's try that. Okay. I don't know if anyone saw this. It was at the Japan Society recently in New York City. It was a virtual live theater thing. If you did, just put it into the chat. I would love to hear from you. So this was, the Dark Master was a live virtual VR theater experience, which was actually directed by a guy who, maybe not surprisingly, was originally a psychologist. And what he, this was remarkable because it was not an interactive experience. It was it wasn't even a 360 video experience. It was a 180 video VR experience. But I have to say it was as impactful and immersive as any full 6 Degree of Freedom experience that I've ever had. So what they did was, you're in this little Japanese sort of restaurant, and you are enlisted by the kind of mad, maybe devilish cook to start cooking, take over his job and start cooking for customers. And it's incredibly powerful. Why? Because they did live cooking on stage. And so what the psychologist realized was that he could hook into old brain memories. We're talking about lizard memories, millions of years old, which is the smell of food. And the other one was sound, especially intimate body sound. So at a certain point, you could hear yourself chewing, and you heard that sound in your ear. And it was almost as if it was coming from inside your body, and it was profound. I can't say anything except it hooked my subconscious in a way that, like, really almost no other VR experience I've had has done. And it was really profound. And that's what I call species memory. So hooking into very, very old brain where it's not even cognitive, processed on a cognitive level anymore. Okay, so let me go here. Okay. But aside from the species memories, I'm going to argue that there's another aspect of shared human memory, and that is aesthetics. So wait, you're going to say, that's a cultural thing. It's Japanese art doesn't look the same as Hilma af Klint, doesn't look the same as, Jackson Pollock, doesn't look the same as African art. Well, yes and no. Although the field of neuroaesthetics is a relatively new area of research, we can make some guesses about the universality of certain artistic experiences. So just look at these abstract paintings, which are incredible, massive paintings, which hopefully some of you saw at the Guggenheim pre-pandemic. And the question is, why are you able to read them? Why are you able to feel anything? Why are you not utterly confused by this? This is probably not something you've ever seen in real life. And one reason may be that the same class of neurons that have been associated with certain forms of empathy, which are called mirror neurons, are associated with our appreciation of art. And there's an amazing quote by Edward Tickner down here at the bottom of the slide. He was actually a psychologist who coined the English term empathy from the German Einfühlung, which is in feeling. And originally, empathy was not what we consider it to be today, which is interpersonal sort of relationships. It was actually considered to be a form of aesthetic sympathy. It was that thing that allowed people seeing abstract movements of then what was modern dance and or painting, abstract painting, to be able to appreciate and have an emotional experience in relation to those things. So let me just go to the next slide here. Okay, so what are these mirror neurons? Well, in a way, you can think about it as a kind of natural virtual reality, an innate form of VR, if you would. Now, I don't have time to review the literature on this, and there's certainly lots of. Bring it up at the end, please do. I'm not an expert on mirror neurons, but I definitely have understanding that there is some controversy around them. But the bottom line is when you see me here waving my hands around, you're actually doing the exact same thing in your brain virtually, the exact same motor neurons, which would allow you to do these exact same motions, are firing in your brain. It's just not being conducted to your muscles. So now we can understand that the emotional impact of art, and actually how we millions of years ago determined how this person approaching us waving their hands with friend or foe might be something really, really important and hardwired into us. Now, what I'm going to show you next is going to blow your mind. I mean, it blew my mind. Anyone who's in film is going to blow their mind, because decades before Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues, who were the discoverers of mirror neurons at the University of Parma, someone whose name you might recognize came up with kind of the same idea in explaining why a very new medium called film, how that operated. So this is a quote, which I'm going to read, from Sergey Eisenstein, the famous Russian Soviet director. And this is a picture from his battleship Potemkin, which if you haven't seen it, my God, you should see it, because that man knew what he was doing in creating film. So what Eisenstein suggests is that film operates on the audience. The reason it's so impactful is because it allows the audience to reflexively repeat in a weakened way the entire movement system of an actor. As a result of the movements produced, the incipient muscular tensions of the spectator are released into the desired emotion. I mean, that is, to me, like just mind-blowing. I mean, that is actually kind of what virtual reality is doing, but allowing you to actually make those movements. And I found this quote in a beautiful little article that was recently published in Artnos Journal. And it's actually an analysis of how volumetric video is being used in Queerskins' ARC to create empathy. It's free, and it's really worth Google translating, because actually Google Translate does Spanish pretty well for those of you who are not Spanish speakers. And it does actually get at some of the things that I'm talking about today. Okay, so with that as context, I'm going to speak briefly about a paper that we published, Empathy as Aesthetic Sympathy in Virtual Reality, which is out of the International Journal of New Media, Technology, and the Arts, which if you can't find a free copy online, please just give me a shout out, and then I can send you a link. So Queerskins' ARC is a narrative VR experience that tells the story of a mother who, having her estranged son to AIDS, reads his diary and allows herself to imagine him alive and in love. So I'm going to ask Tanya to play the trailer now. Tanya, do you think you could do that? But I do hope that you guys will have the time to experience it either as full 6-stop experience for those of you with the tethered headset, or as 360 video on Oculus TV for those of you with Quest. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to let Tanya do the screen share. Okay. So our goal was really to find a way to create intimacy and a sense of connection to the male lovers. And specifically, we wanted to create a situation that would encourage participant proximity and bodily interaction with the couple, and that would hopefully generate positive emotions in the participants. And at the same time, we didn't want the participant to play anyone but themselves. We wanted them to play themselves so that they would have the opportunity to sort of address or confront their own biases and desires in deciding how they were going to move in relation to the men. Okay, don't need that. No. Okay. So the decisions, in the end, we based the final experience on some key design concepts. And these decisions were based on a combination of intuition and extensive reading on my part and research and prototyping experiments that we performed. So basically, in this, what you're going to see is that the world of the mother is real, but very constricted. And for this, we purposely used 360 video to give the viewer a sense of passivity and helplessness. And aesthetically, everything is in the first scene is sort of sound-wise is muffled. The lighting is dim. Things are a little indistinct, kind of like a memory. And then you are moved through a window, and in a kind of windy Peter Pan moment, brought in to the light, literally, and into the mother's imagination as she reads her son's diary. And then in the second, in her imagination now, this is where you are in the scenes here, which we shot with volumetric video, the figures are aestheticized, they're beautiful, vibrant light particles that move, and the participant has now gained full 6 degrees of freedom and is able to decide how they move through in relation to the men. So basically we used agency and freedom of movement to create a narrative arc. 360 video was associated with a mother and her grief and her constricted life, and then 6 degrees of freedom and volumetric video was used for her imagination. And then aesthetically, we moved from real, quote unquote, in the 360 mother scenes to sort of sublime, colorful, vibrant sound and music in the volumetric scenes. And we use the prototyping experiments to come up with an embodied language, I would say, a body-to-body kind of logic that we hope would override or at least complicate mental processes, because really, who doesn't want to fly? Okay, so in writing the script and deciding on the kinds of tech that we would use, I drew inspiration from this woman, Sarah Ahmed, who's, if you have not read her book, Queer Phenomenology, doesn't matter whether you're gay or straight, it will be very applicable to people who are interested in spatial construction and VR. So she suggested alternative ways of constructing space, and the objects we bring attention to in that space might end up redirecting our attention towards different objects, those that are less proximate, or even those that deviate or are deviant. So we decided to create an experience where the proximity or distance to two gay men expressing physical love would be a critical part of the experience. And to come up with a design, we performed 3 prototyping experiments prior to shooting. So this was really an experience. So we leaned into third wave HCI principles and started by orienting our participants to the narrative and what was going to be the subsequent VR experience by having them read a synopsis and a script of the experience. And then we basically had them watch this little stick figure guy dancing around to Chopin's Nocturne number 2, opus 9. And the figure's hands and head left traces of light in the environment. And our hypothesis was that a feeling of connection between, there'd be this feeling of connection between the participant and the dancer, because they'd be sort of co-creating this environment, and then they'd both be moving through the environment. But in a series of questions, we found out that was actually not the case. So the visitors really didn't feel like their ability to make traces with their hands had anything to do with the dancer, did not connect them to the dancer. And so we hypothesized this was caused by the aesthetic characteristics of these traces, that they were too big, that they remained too long, difficult to orient relative to the dancer in this sort of black space. But the one thing we took away from that experiment was that everyone watches a dancer. It doesn't matter if it's a little stick figure guy. Everyone, like, people would make little traces with their hands, they get bored, and then they would go right back to watching the dancer. So that was actually really important for us to know. So the second set of experiments, we tried out a scheme, a couple things. We changed the aesthetics of the traces, and then Brandon Powers, who was choreographing it in segments, decided that maybe if we sort of gave the visitors a response to the movements they were making, that they would feel a connection. So if you were making large movements with your arms and you used a lot of the space, you would get a certain kind of dance choreography in response that was very big and gestural. And if you were not making a bunch of movement, that you get a very still form of choreography. And then we basically realized that nobody could read it, was completely illegible, which is a key factor in human-computer interaction design. If nobody understands what's going on, then you can have the most elaborate scheme in the world, it's completely pointless. So we dropped that. And in the end, we ended up randomizing a lot of it. And then we did a third experiment where we used a really rough and dirty depth kit of the live dancers, and then took out all the traces just to see how everyone would respond to that. And as it turned out, everyone stood there with their hands like this, like with their arms crossed across their chest, was exactly not what we wanted to have happen in relation to the dancers. So we realized we definitely had to have them do something with their hands. We went into production, let's just say, with some basic ideas, which we thought we could explore further and play with in post-production. And these included the use of freedom of movement and agency to create an emotional arc and to create positive emotions in the visitors. So the final experiment that we did took place in a it was actually a beautiful space. It was a 30-foot diameter play space, which was what we filmed the original choreography on at Intel Studios, which we used a Vive Pro wireless headset and hand trackers. And the participants were asked before and immediately after the experience about their, this is the first sort of tool you see here, the other in self scale. And participants were asked to circle the picture that best described their relationship with either the gay couple in the experience, the mother, or gay men as a group, using that scale. And then they were also asked to respond to the experience in terms of what their emotions were, using the Plotnick's emotional color wheel. So this was not a scientific experiment. It was an art and design prototyping test, but what we found was really interesting. Basically, everyone felt much closer to the men, as measured by the self and other scale, than they did to the mother. And 25% noted that they felt closer to gay men as a group after the experience. And in terms of the emotions that were produced, the most common feelings associated with the beach scene, which was scene 2, were interest, serenity, joy, and love. And the most common feelings associated with the dance scene were serenity, amazement, awe, and interest. And by comparison, the most common feelings associated with the participants in the attic scene were, with the mother, was pensiveness, anticipation, sadness, and in the last scene, acceptance and apprehension. So bottom line is we don't have any proof. We are not acting as scientists here. We don't have any proof that freedom of movement, which included flying in the final version of the dance, increased agency, or sublime aesthetics, encouraging approach behavior and intimacy with gay men in a setting that literally would not be possible in real life, could produce empathy. But we do think that it shows that movement, gesture, and aesthetics are all worthy of investigation and empathy research. I'm going to end by saying that I truly, truly believe that virtual reality has the potential to change how we perceive ourselves and our relationship to others and to the world. Reality as we know it and experience it is being radically changed by our being extended through digital media. But in a way, it points out the fact that all realities, even real world reality, is an aesthetic experience. What we notice, what we value, what we preserve and valorize are all aesthetic decisions. What we do in the virtual world has the potential to change that, or to constrict or simplify or neutralize this complexity and richness of our real lived experiences. No comment. And finally, because this is called Games for Change, I recognize that video games are a leading example of the potential that digital media offers to create a kind of magic circle where the law no longer applies. And I think we can use game and game logic and to imagine and prototype new ways of being in the world. And I think that that's what Games for Change is all about. And I hope that this talk has given you some food for thought, and that all of you will rise to that challenge. So thank you. Any questions? Please, you're welcome to come on board, or just, yeah, raise your hand. I don't know if there's, let me see if I have some questions in the chat. Smell design, yeah, I think that's the next big thing. Movement. Did you get any measure of attitudes before the experience? Yeah, we did. So we did measure sort of inclusion of self and other to gay men as a group before the experience, and we also measured attitudes in terms of how I forgot what the exact wording was, but how comfortable would you be to see a gay couple kissing, have them over to dinner, or have them be colleagues at work? We, not surprising since we're doing this in New York City, and this is not a random sample, these were basically a call out on Facebook, we found that we had an incredibly liberal group. We did have 3 Jesuits in training, that's a whole nother story, and 2 of them had a little bit of problem with seeing men kiss on the street. But in any case, what we did find is universally that experience, as I went through the experience, their relationship to the men in the VR got closer. And then in 25% of those people, they felt more close to gay men as a group as measured by that inclusion of self and other scale. Did your test cohort include women of the same age as the mother? Yes, it did. Not all of them, but we did have a few of them, and we didn't have enough of them to say whether or not that made a difference. That's a really good point, though. But the answer is no, we did not have that kind of data. Okay. Let's see. Present downloadable to my screen reader. Yeah, sure. I can put up a link for that. Is empathy with self a thing? How would it be supported in games and art? Any research on this? Jerry, could you just, do you mind coming onto the screen or putting or talking? Can you just explain a little bit more about what you mean? Or you could type it. Oh, sorry, let me just do this first before I'm even, oh, there you go. There's some of our information. So I'm gonna say, let me see, empathy with self. Well, I may not be answering the question right, but I do wanna say that I think that what I'm really interested in doing is expanding a sense of self in terms of expanding a sense of care, which, as we looked at the slide on empathy, that really blurring the line, distinguishing between self and other, while at the same time maintaining a real physical, real presence, not just a transcendent kind of presence in that experience. And the reason is that for us, there is this worry for me that the potential, the possibility of VR for transcendence and transcendent experience will erase the reality of everyday life. Because the fact of the matter is that, like this, like we can all be happy and look like we live in a pottery barn in Facebook Horizons, but the fact of the matter is that you know, there's still, if you're a Black person and you're stopped by the cops on a traffic stop, you're in trouble. So it doesn't matter whether you're, you know, like once you get out of the VR, that's what we got. We got what the distinctions between self and other actually are in the real world, and we need to work on those. And I'm not saying that Facebook Horizons can't contribute to a better world. I hope that they do. Aesthetically leaves something to be desired, but the bottom line is that I think that it's a tricky thing, that distinguishing between self and other, and empathy with self is not specifically something that I've thought about, more about an expansion of self. Let's see if there's anything. I'm gonna have to go soon. Let's see. Oh, in emotional awareness. Again, I think that that's a really interesting idea. It's not one that I've broached, but I mean, that's one I could use. So I would love to think about that. And I'm sorry not to answer your question, but it's definitely not something that I've thought that much about. But it's really interesting. So Jerry, if you want to make that experience, I think you should. Yes, Brandon is saying, please come by our booth to talk more. And then, do you think that empathy in video games, generally not VR, can be impactful for players? Oh, yeah, for sure. I think that any kind of sort of interactive media, I think that the power of VR is that physical movement through space and time and presence is especially potent. But I think that we can have empathy through traditional media, through film, through music, through reading. So certainly video games can do it. Let's see. Thank you. The research on empathy shows it can move attitudes in short term, but it's not great at moving in the long term. Do you feel this is true? And I think that it is true, of course, because it's like one of the, you know, you go back to your regular life. You know, there is this thing which I call virtual absolution, which is something I really, really want to avoid, which is you get to go into a VR experience and be a good person, and then you can ignore the homeless dude on the street as you walk past because you did a good thing today. Yeah, I don't think so. Let's not have virtual absolution. Let's definitely not have like going to, you know, sort of, you can play a Auschwitz victim for 5 minutes, because I really don't want to live in a world where that exists. In any case, I think that, Howard, to your point, we got to look at how those things operate over time. But I think that as more and more of these, as we get better at developing the language of VR and these experiences, and actually having, as Brandon was mentioning, having the ability to build together in worlds, that actually might be more profound. So I think the potential is definitely there. We just haven't gotten there yet. But I would love to see more interaction between artists, designers, neuroscientists, psychologists, really working on this stuff together, because I don't think that the scientists are very good at art, and most artists aren't very good at science. So I think that the potential for collaborations would be amazing. Do you think the short-term movement can be reinforced through practice and a follow-up VR experience? I mean, so I've been a practicing Buddhist for 20 years. So you know what? I meditate several times a day. And let me tell you, I've been doing it for 20 years. And it takes a long time. It takes a lot of practice, but you definitely can change your mind. So yes, I agree with you, Roger. Practice definitely is what we need to change consciousness. So, you know, there could be a wondrous experience where you just pop that on your head and you're good for the day. And I'm sure people will work on that. So thanks, everyone. And thank you for your enthusiasm. I really appreciate it. Please reach out. All of us here, Cyril, me, Brandon, we're all excited to talk to you more about this. And if you have any questions, let us know. Thanks so much.